Welcome to You Can Talk to Me, a Beatles podcast. It's time to make our way across the universe and talk all things John, Paul, George and Ringo.
Jim, thank you for joining me here on the You Can Talk to Me Beatles podcast. It's great to finally get to sit with you after having been aware of you for some time.
Thanks very much, Mike. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here today. Thank you.
My pleasure. Let me tell you, I have been someone that discovered you initially through social media content, and then I started to dig deeper and find out more about your work. And in doing a little research before we get into Beatledom, it seemed that in your early years, professionally, you were on a very different journey in terms of your professional life before we came to know you now as the rock and roll detective, and you were plugged into this world of popular music. I'm just curious about that transition for you, and also understanding if music and writing for you have always been important.
Right. Good question. Well, I started out going to school to become a lawyer, and I became a trial attorney in both Chicago and then in a few years later in Wisconsin, which is the state above Chicago for those listening in Australia. And then I later graduated to becoming what's called a general counsel, which is the attorney for a corporation. And so I did that for 3 decades of my career, but I always spent my free time reading about the Beatles, writing about the Beatles, writing about rock and roll. At first it was for music magazines, such as Goldmine Magazine, Musician Magazine. Then I began, and I was still working as an attorney, but around 1992, I started working on my first book called Black Market Beatles, The Story Behind Their Lost Recordings. And then I thought, it might be fun to sort of alternate between a Beatle book and then a rock and roll book, kind of go back and forth. So the next book was called Nevermind Nirvana. It was about the making of Nirvana's Nevermind album, and I saw a lot of similarities between the Beatles and, in fact, Nirvana's love of the Beatles, and how what they did in the 1990s there were some similarities about how they just exploded onto the scene. Their music was the death knell for the previous music, which was heavy metal at the time. And alternative rock or grunge became the big thing. And I thought, that's kind of similar to what the Beatles did. In their era, they started a whole new, wave of rock and roll. Then the next book was The Beatle Who Vanished. There's the new edition is called The Beatle Who Vanished, the 60th Beatles anniversary tour, which is about Jimmie Nicol, who got to be a Beatle for 2 weeks as a drummer. And then alternated back then to a rock book called Mysteries in the Music, Case Closed, which involved a book that has multiple chapters and different chapters where I solve mysteries, such as, did the Beach Boys steal a song from murderer Charles Manson? Or did the CIA attempt to kill Bob Marley? And then there's also a Beatle chapter in there about, did the Beatles, the Stones, and Bob Dylan really want to start a supergroup, which was later dubbed the Masked Marauders in Rolling Stone magazine. So I dig into all these things. I find the people who are still alive. I find the documents. I find all the things that I learned as a trial lawyer became very handy to be the rock and roll detective. And then I started consulting for George Harrison in 1998, which was the biggest thrill of my life. And then towards the end of his life, he recommended me to the Beatles and Neil Aspinall and Apple, so I got to do work for them. I've worked for the rock band Garbage, which I understand have visited Australia many times. They love Australia. And I work on box set projects, or another sort of a different thing for the Beatles was the Cirque du Soleil Love Show. working on documentaries for Martin Scorsese, for Peter Jackson, and many others, who are maybe not as well known. So
Yeah.
even though I started as a lawyer, I was still doing some of these things in the background. And then once I retired from law, which was pretty early, like 51, I think, 51 years old, um, I then got to do all this full time, and it was wonderful.
Yeah. Were there any writers in your formative years that inspired you that you looked at and thought, oh, there's a benchmark, and I think I can, or were you very much your own
Yeah,
inspiration, your own source?
that's funny. I never really had like writers who I read everything. I read all the magazines, I read all the books, but I guess I just never thought of it that way. I just thought of, well, I'm gonna try my own thing and hopefully people will find it interesting, and hopefully I can write in a way that is storytelling, because
Yeah.
that's what I like to do orally. So I wanted to be able to be a storyteller in writing in books as well.
And we'll certainly get to Jimmie Nicol's story. I think The Beatle Who Vanished is truly one of the great Beatle books. It's such a wonderful read. You did
Well,
mention
honored.
some of your credits, and I'd love to go through them briefly for listeners that may not know. As you mentioned, Peter Jackson's Get Back, Scorsese's George Harrison Living in the Material World, Ron Howard's 8 Days a Week, the touring years. It goes on, the work with the Harrison estate that you mentioned. All of this is still just naming a few because it's quite exhaustive.
Yeah.
With just a focus on that consultancy side of what you do and what you've done, is there one particular Beatles project? I'm sure they've all been thrilling, but is there one that kind of really hit you and was extremely satisfying or exciting for a particular reason?
Well, I'll start with Martin Scorsese's George Harrison Living in the Material World. Just knowing that you were working on a Scorsese film was amazing, and I still remember the night that Olivia Harrison called me up, and she called me up and she said, and I thought she was in England and I was in the Midwest, so I looked at my clock when she called, and I was like, oh my God, it's like 1 a.m, and she's calling me. And we had never talked. We had done a little emailing because I had first worked for George, so she was aware of me and wanted me to continue working for her. And I said, "Oh, Olivia, you're calling pretty late. Is it? It must be like." I said, "It must be 13 o'clock where you are." And she said, "No, I'm in LA. It's actually 6 o'clock, and you're at 8 o'clock." I said, "Oh, good, good. Well, we're all awake." But that was when she said, "Would you like to help me on this film I'm working on with Marty?" I said, "Marty, would that be Martin Scorsese?" So I was just on cloud nine. So it was an amazing 4 year project, and I got to go to New York a lot to meet with the production people. And I think I most enjoyed sitting with David Tedeschi, who was the editor, who really put a lot of this together, and helping him. His biggest thing was, he said, "There's so many hardcore Beatle fans. I don't want them to be bored with the footage. And
Mm.
this is going to be a 90-minute film. I only want fresh footage." And so we're sitting there, and I said, "All right, I can tell you if something's been viewed too many times or where there's something's really new." And so he showed me this scene, which is in the movie, and George is sitting in a TV studio, and he's looking up at monitors of the Beatles in the 60s in black and white, still, playing, and he's joking about John wearing glasses and all these things. And I said, "Oh my God, I've never seen this clip before." I said, "This clip must have been mislabeled in a studio." And I said, "I can tell you it's never been broadcast anywhere, or I would have seen it."
Yeah.
And he said, "How could you possibly know that?" And I said, "I'm the rock and roll detective." What did I tell you? So we laughed, and he said, "Well, you sure are." He said, "It turns out that this was mislabeled, and we asked this one company to go through and open everything up, the cans. And there they found that It was an unbroadcast clip of George Harrison, and it had been mislabeled as, I don't know, going to the zoo or some news story unrelated to George Harrison. So that was a fun for me to be able to show him what I knew. Plus, it was fun to find something so fresh for the fans. It's a really enjoyable scene.
Yeah.
In 2002, I was asked to help. Neil Aspinall contacted me and he said, we want to rework the Let It Be film and maybe make it into a long form documentary. And I said, oh, that would be really cool. And he said, but there's one problem. We're missing 500 reels of what's called the Nagra B-roll audio. And I said, oh yeah, I'm aware of that. And he goes, well, George Harrison told us at his last meeting with Apple that if anybody could find it, you can. So that's what we want you to do, is to find this lost audio, because then we can sync it. There were basically two cameras most of the time when Let It Be was filmed, an A camera and a B camera. So, you have different angles, or one camera's capturing Ringo and another's capturing John and Yoko or whatever. Well, the reels of the audio were separately on these Nagra tape recorders. And when one would run out, the reel, because I think they were only like 13 or 14 minutes long, the other one would be rolling with a new full set, so that there wouldn't be a problem where they'd say, oh, we missed part of this song or we missed part of this dialogue. So they would overlap. So that's why it was important to have both the A roll and the B roll. You couldn't sync it all up and put together all this extra footage without having those. So it was very rewarding for me to locate those tapes for them. And they were able to then I don't think Peter Jackson was involved yet, but then ultimately he got involved and they were able to make the whole thing. And I think anybody who's seen that film, it's just so wonderful to be a fly on the wall and see the Beatles, rehearsing, joking, all that. I also think that it was important because the cut that is Let It Be tends to make people think that it was a very down, depressing period and they were breaking up and all that. But when you see more of it and you can hear what they're saying, you see that they really were having fun together. And they really were enjoying making music together. And sure, they had these legal problems or other issues between them. But Peter Jackson's film really shows, I think, that it was much more of an upbeat event for them. So, and then I guess the last thing was really that, I know you only asked for one, but sometimes it's hard to pin it down. But the last thing that was really fun was that comes to mind is working on locating specific audio that Neil Aspinall wanted for the Cirque du Soleil Love Show in Vegas. As we all know, Giles Martin mashed together different songs to make sort of fresh new versions of Beatle music. But there's a part in the show where all of the Cirque du Soleil actors go off and you see these sort of shadowy images of the Beatles in the room. And you hear them talking, laughing, joking, tuning their guitars, etc. And so that was my contribution. I was given very specific dates and, we want stuff from this period to that period and, clear audio and all that. And then Giles Martin put it together into a really nice montage of fun sounds. So you really feel like you're in the room with the Beatles when you watch that.
Yeah. Wow, there's a lot there.
Those are highlights for me. Those were a lot of fun. And to be able to help your favorite band, not just your favorite band, let's just admit they're the greatest band of all time.
That's right.
So what an honor for me. Just a great honor.
Yeah, you're doing the Lord's work, because all of that work is a gift back out to the world. And historically those time capsules they go on, and
And it'll last forever. People will be able to enjoy these things forever. So I
yeah.
feel good about it.
What's that experience like for you when you get through the forensic work of tracking down and locating that material? What's it like for you when you first sit back and watch it as a fan and see everything in context, beyond knowing that you played a role in that, but when you see how it all marries together, what's that like for you?
It's just a really happy feeling. Even, I do a lot of things for lesser known directors and uh, people that, maybe musicians that aren't as famous or whatever. But I get the same feeling of accomplishment, I guess. Like, hey, I helped the director realize his story or her story. And to me, that's a good feeling, just uh, oh, I remember that, I remember that. But the big thing is they're able to come together and finish something that's so important to them, and you
Mm.
helped. And one story that comes to mind, Tyler Measom is a great uh, director in Hollywood of rock and roll documentaries, and he was making a documentary about the heavy metal music era, which I really was not that familiar with. But he said, "Hey, you're the rock and roll detective. You can find anything." So he put a lot of pressure on me because I didn't feel as confident. But he said, "There's this scene. We can't do the movie unless you find this video." I said, "Oh, no pressure. What is it?" And he said, "Well, there was a wedding that took place in the 80s in New Jersey, the state of New Jersey, and a guy named Sebastian Bach, who was no one knew him at the time, jumped up on stage and sang with the wedding band, and then there were people in the audience in the music industry who heard him and said, we got to sign this guy up, and then he became a big rock and roll singer with a band and
Skid
in that
Row,
era.
was it?
Skid
Yeah,
Row, that's
yeah.
right. So I said, all right, well, answer a few questions for me. Okay. Who got married? We don't know. Well, where did the marriage take place? Well, in New Jersey, Jim. I said, New Jersey's a big state. Can we narrow down the city? Don't know the city. Do we know the venue where the reception took place? No. Do we know who was in the band? No. Uh, do we know what year it was? No, Jim, we don't know anything about it. We just know that there's a rumor that this video exists and I have to have it in the movie. So, I looked everywhere on the internet and I think I went to Tor, which is like this deep underground site where bad people go to do bad things. I went everywhere. I went to every heavy metal like fan club forum, every bootleg place for heavy metal. And people all said, oh, yeah, we heard about that, but we've never seen it. So finally, after going to page like 26 on Google looking for it, and whoever gets past the first page of Google results, I said, I need to take a break and just rethink this. And, maybe something, I'll just throw it up to the heavens. Maybe something will happen. So for a week, I went and did other things that I could find for that movie, and I felt good about that. But I kept, worrying like he can't make this movie without me finding this magical moment. So I one day I get a phone call out of the blue, and it was Alex Orbison, Roy Orbison's
Mm.
youngest son, and he said, "Hey Jim, I just read your book on my tour." And I said, which book did you read? He said, Mysteries in the Music, Case Closed. It was great. I loved it. And, we were talking about it in the band, and he's in a band with, like, uh, children of the Allman Brothers.
Huh.
So I think it's called the Allman Brother Revival Band, and he's the drummer, and it's a great band if
Right.
people ever see them. And I said, that's great. I'm really happy. I'm glad you liked the book. He said, hey, I got a buddy who's going out on his own tour in a week. I was wondering if you'd send him a signed copy. I said, sure. What's his name and address? I'll send it to him. And he said, his name's Sebastian Bach. And I was like, what?
Come
Sebastian
on.
Bach? I said, I got to talk to him. He said, why do you need to talk to him? I explained what I've just told you. And he said, all right, well, here's his email. You can start with an email. And I wrote to him. I said, I'll be sending you this book, but I'm not sending it unless you tell me who got married, who's got the video, where it took place, when it was. And he gave me all the information and said, this guy who got married, the groom, actually took the video, and he's a photographer, and he has other great photos of the heavy metal era. So not only did we get the video, I get the video for the director, who was thrilled, but we also found a whole nother batch of really cool photos from that era that he could use in the documentary. So sometimes you get lucky.
I don't know if you got lucky as much as you got divine intervention, because you even said, I'm going to put it to the heavens.
I put it up to the heavens.
And that series of events that happen, which are beyond your influence, are ridiculous.
Yeah, I had no control. And then to have someone call me and it's a friend of Sebastian Bach. So I'm forever grateful.
That's a great story. It suggests that you are living the life you were destined to be living.
Ah, good point. That's a good point.
It sounds like you are completely on purpose in universal flow with a story like that.
It that way, Mike.
That's what it feels like.
It does. It sure does. Well, and those things have happened before too. That's not the first time.
Yeah, no, that is wonderful. If we were to jump lanes and talk about this guy that comes onto the scene seemingly out of complete obscurity, and for a little under 2 weeks, he's a Beatle. And of course, we're talking about Jimmie Nicol. His life is completely transformed. I'm curious how inspiration hit you to focus in on what is a very singular rock and roll story with, as you mentioned, the greatest band in the world. And you delivered then what I said earlier, one of the great Beatle books, The Beatle Who Vanished, which brings Jimmy to life. When and how did that inspiration hit you to go, this is one I have to mine and really open up?
Well, I just thought, I guess I had always thought that history had basically ignored him, and that the media had sort of considered him a one-dimensional blip in Beatle history. I looked around I read a bunch of British music history books. None of them mentioned him. It was always just one sentence in a few different Beatle books that said, Ringo got tonsillitis and a guy named Jimmie Nicol took over. And that's it. And I kept thinking, there must be more to this guy. And also, what was it like for him as a human being to be working his way up as a drummer, and then what's it like when you're just an everyday guy? And in fact, he said he was quoted as saying, "One day I was walking down the street and not a single girl even looked at me. The next day I got out of a limousine with John, Paul, and George, and these girls are screaming and tearing my clothes apart." So I mean, just think how would you deal with that? That's really interesting. And then when you've been to the top of the entertainment mountain with the Beatles and everyone in the world now knows you, how do you live the rest of your life? What do you do? And so I was looking at it not just as telling the story that had never been told before, and not just talking about the history and the mystery of the vanishing, but also humanizing him, because there was a man there who wanted to make his mark in the world. He was an individualist and he was very creative, and he didn't want to be just known as a deputy Beatle. He had accomplished so much more in his lifetime, as I discovered: producing, recording, writing music, serving as A&R man at RCA in Mexico, playing in other bands, teaching music to kids, and so much more. So I just really wanted to get beyond the mass media tabloid stuff and tell the story of a real person who was talented, musical, and in fact, if he hadn't been so talented, he would not have been selected to take Ringo's place for those couple weeks on tour.
Mm. I think you succeed there in this really delicate balancing act of successfully having depth, detail, and pace. And often one can be sacrificed for the other. But I found it succeeded on those three fronts. And again, no small achievement. And it does bring him to life. I think before your book, I'm keen to know what you believe might have been some common misconceptions about him, beyond just being this token guy that maybe got lucky. Were there misconceptions you found in the history around him?
That's a good question. Well, I just think that the papers built him up as the fifth Beatle. So even while he was with the Beatles, they were calling him the fifth Beatle in the British newspapers, and maybe in Australia as well. I don't know, but within a year after the Beatles, he hadn't done so well. So that was something that surprised me. He started off doing well. He created his own band, Jimmie Nicol and the Shub Dubs. He used talented people, but they were all studio musicians, and eventually they all had to go back to the studio because that's where the money was. And also, as time goes on, it's hard for a drummer in the back row who's not out front singing. It's hard for them to sustain that kind of media attention. And the guy that was singing was not very dynamic, we'll say. And so, they built him up, and then as the shows started to shrink in size and fewer tours and things, then he had overspent on buying equipment and paying the guys a lot of money because he knew that to keep them out of the studio, he had to keep up with their pay rates. Many of them were, family men and had bills to pay. But ultimately, that caused him to go bankrupt. His wife divorced him, and ultimately, by like June of 1965, a year after, he was unemployed. And I thought, wow, that's something I didn't see coming. And then, of course, the media tore him down, because that's what sells newspapers. We build people up, we cut them down. And we see that every day in the media with actors, with musicians, whatever. So I felt really bad about that. The good thing is Paul McCartney saw these articles and was sad to hear about this. So he actually went behind the scenes and talked to Peter Asher, and Peter and Gordon then hired Jimmie to work on their records and also do some local British touring with them, and just to keep him going, keep him employed. Jimmie had moved back into his mom's house, but then he got a call out of the blue, and things picked up again. And I don't want to bore the audience by narrating the whole book, but it's really interesting how good things then came out of the blue and put him on the right track again. And so those sorts of things were quite interesting to discover. And were things that I didn't expect.
If we go back before the Beatles moment happens for Jimmie, I was surprised to find that he'd already been a hard-working and highly regarded drummer on the London scene, very well established, in fact, before he gets that phone call in early June 1964. We hear a lot about the Liverpool scene and how vital that was, but it seems like London was also swinging pretty early on as well. and he was right there in the center of it. Could you unpack a little bit of that
Yes,
period and the context of his time?
sure. It was a cool period. London had some clubs. One of the big ones was called the Two Eyes Coffee Club. Another one was called the Flamingo Club. And these places were packed. What's interesting is the young kids were going there, and these were evening jam sessions, evening show performances, and they're all drinking coffee. I'm thinking they probably didn't get to bed till 5, or else they just got up and went to work, because they're still awake, because they drank coffee all night. But those two clubs and some of the others were where many of the first generation of London rockers got their start. Tommy Steele, Joe Brown, who became a good friend of George Harrison's, Colin Hicks, who was the younger brother of Tommy Steele, Vince Eager, another singer who Jimmy toured with, Georgie Fame, who later started Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames, but he started out as just a keyboard player who would jump in whenever there was a keyboard on stage, and people started to see that he was a great keyboard player and a good singer, and several others, and then there was this guy named Larry Parnes who came along, and he was really the first guy in England to package up these groups and take them on these tours. And he always would come up with some clever marketing name for the tours to get the kids excited. So he packaged these tours, which I detail in the book. And in fact, Jimmy was what was kind of interesting, another one of those weird discoveries that you never expected. When Larry Parnes auditioned the Beatles in 1960 in May and hired them to go to Scotland, they were backing up Johnny Gentle, a singer, and the Beatles were the backup band, and got to really, for the first time, leave their country and go tour in Scotland. And so at the same time, Larry Parnes had put together another tour in Scotland at the same exact time as the Beatles, and Jimmie Nicol was playing drums with Vince Eager and the Quiet Three. So I thought that's quite the coincidence. But again, it all emanated from things starting in those London coffee clubs with all these different groups, and all these people went on to have really nice careers. And I just wanted to learn how Jimmy came up in the world and paid his dues. And from his work with those people, that got him into learning different drumming styles, because sometimes he'd play in a big band. That's one type. Sometimes he'd play reggae or rock or whatever. So he had to learn a lot of styles, and then he got to be invited into the recording scene at Pi Records, where he would back up people. And I think that was really fortunate, because one of these producers came in and started what many of us kids, we used to have this in America too, and we considered it a ripoff, but they would take like several hits of famous groups and put them on a record, and we'd buy it thinking we were getting a collection of these hits, but they were covers by unknown artists. So Jimmy got to be doing that, and at the time it was called Top Six, the Top Six label, and those were like the top 6 songs on the charts. Well, guess who had most of those top 6? The Beatles.
Yeah.
So just amazingly, Ringo got to learn. Not Ringo. Jimmie Nicol got to learn Ringo's drum parts by recording these crummy knockoffs.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
all that stuff's really interesting. When you delve into it and you start to discover all these coincidences. And think of it, when they found Jimmie Nicol, he didn't have to sit there for 2-3 days and rehearse, and they didn't have 2-3 days. He played for like 20 minutes at EMI Studios, and they're like, all right, you're in. These parts, these songs. How lucky was that for the Beatles?
Yeah, it is such a remarkable story. And most of our listeners might be aware of the circumstances that lead to Jimmy coming in. Ringo is hospitalised with tonsillitis. The boys have booked dates and venues on the eve of the First World Tour. Brian, no doubt, is trying to pull it all together and not have this entire opportunity collapse in on itself.
Right.
He has to negotiate with these strong-willed individuals, who are already saying from the outset, we're going to write and record our own things. We're going to push back on how do you do it. We're going to have a voice. I've often wondered, they obviously loved him and he loved them, but I've often wondered how that negotiation must have gone, particularly with George, on we should really be thinking about doing this. What do we know about how Brian tackled that?
Well, so Brian had spent more than a year organizing the first ever world tour. And I know from spending 8 hours in a Melbourne archive reading all the correspondence and details of just the Australian leg of the tour. The promoter gave all of his records to this museum and archive in Melbourne, so I was able to look. And I thought, oh my gosh, there's letters between, everything was letters. It was all snail mail, as we call it. No emails. And back then, even Brian could not have afforded long distance calls from London to Melbourne to talk through all this stuff. It all had to just be in writing, because for those of you who weren't around in the 60s like I was, we couldn't even call my grandmother across the country very often for more than 5 minutes because it was so expensive to make a long distance call. So imagine an international. So they had to work through hotels, the venues, the flights, the limos, the security, the extra instruments, the advertising, the ticket sales, the warm-up bands, and the contracts. And all the contracts were signed after all this was done for a year through snail mail. There was no insurance. Like today, we have insurance for an illness cancellation. We hear about people all the time. They got sick. The tour will be redone next year. There were no what we call out clauses in the contracts, which means there was no exception that you can cancel or you can postpone if there's an illness. It was the show must go on. So Epstein had to explain all of this to the boys and how badly things would go if they did not show up. And I think at first Lennon and McCartney understood that and realized that. But George had a valid point. He was adamant. He said, without Ringo, we're not the Beatles. And he made this point, because he was loyal to Ringo and to the fact that the Beatles were made up of John, Paul, George, and Ringo. However, Brian explained that there was just no way to cancel. And if they did, they'd be sued for more money than they had ever made. The media around the world would basically ruin their reputation, end their career, and that would be it. And so George had to come around and understand that that was the case. And business decisions had to triumph over his loyalty and friendship with Ringo. And I think he joked about it in the Beatles anthology, and George said something like, yeah, I wasn't too pleased, but then, how many guys does it take to screw in a light bulb? 4.
Yeah.
So, and what would have been interesting is what if it had been John or Paul, or even George? Maybe they couldn't have continued, because they all three were the main singers and George was the lead guitarist. So in a way, they were sort of lucky because you can replace a drummer more easily than the other people.
Let that be a controversial remark for drummers out there to go, hey, wait a minute, what?
Sorry to all drummers. I love drummers, so I'm sorry. I know a lot of them, too. And they would say, hey. No,
What's that
the
old joke
drummer.
when the drummer comes along to the studio or to the jam session and say, "Hey guys, I've written a song." You know, there's this old joke about, yeah, that's fine. Would you mind just getting behind the kit and grab the sticks? Yeah, but so much of their story is almost preordained as well. There's this sense of this chance meeting here, that moment there. And when you put all the pieces together and look back historically, it's almost like
Yeah.
this perfect setup that you can't imagine was just left to chance. It's quite remarkable. There's footage of
Right.
an interview on Dutch TV. Obviously, you'll be more well aware than I am during that tour. And there's this lovely tight shot with Paul extreme left, John in the centre, and Jimmy up close on the right. And just to go to my notes here, he's asked, was it difficult for you to take on the role of Ringo? He has this awkward look across his shoulder back to the boys. Paul
Yeah.
immediately starts chewing his nail on one of his fingers. Then he looks back and says, "No, not really, but I could never make up for what Ringo is." And there's a little laugh. He then gets the question, "Are they treating you good?" And again, he
Yeah.
looks over to his right. They have a look and a laugh, and John's smiling, and he looks back and says, "Marvelous." And again, I'm probably projecting onto it, but it always seemed to me
It's awkward.
it's awkward and odd, and it seems like there's something going on there that
Right.
seems a little off. When you look at that and dig into the story, do you get a sense of what that was like for him with the three in that period?
Yeah, I think that we have to keep in mind that this was their first real moment together doing a question and answer or an interview. They had to everything was a big rush. They had less than 24 hours after Ringo went into the hospital to find a drummer, then to get him he didn't have a passport. He didn't even have a suitcase. Imagine that. So he had to borrow a suitcase from a friend of his that was a studio musician. And and Jimmy had a wife and son. He had to tell them. And and then they had to send Ringo's suit over that night and adjust it because Jimmie Nicol was much more husky than Ringo, so they had to let out Ringo's, stage outfit. He had been growing his hair out. As you can see, I have too been growing my
As
Beatle.
as have I, but you're a little ahead of me. I'm still doing the caps until I can embrace it and be at peace with
Right,
myself.
right. But he was growing, a kind of a Beatle haircut, but then they had sent someone over to cut it so it was more sort of bowl-like, which they all had at the time. So it was a big rush, and then the next day it's off to the airport and on the plane, and the next thing you know, they're plopped in front of this guy. So I don't think they had really gotten a chance to know Jimmy, the other Beatles, and I don't think that he had gotten to know them yet because it was still rush, rush, rush. But when they got on the next big flight, which was from London to Hong Kong, um, which was really the next leg of the tour, it turned out that by, again, luck and circumstances, Tony Sheridan was on the plane. And Tony Sheridan had really acted as a teacher to the Beatles in Hamburg and shown them and told them about a lot of things, including Prellies, which we call them speed, I think, here in America. But he had taught them a lot, and when they heard that he was back in the coach section, they brought him up to first class, which was just the Beatles. And all of a sudden, they see Jimmie Nicol and Tony Sheridan embrace, and the Beatles are like, "What's going on?" And I was lucky enough to interview Tony Sheridan about that moment, and he said the Beatles didn't realize that I had had Jimmy in my band long before I ever even went to Hamburg to meet the Beatles. Well, the point of this story is that during that 10, 15, 20-hour flight, because it was propellers back then, from London to Hong Kong, and I think it had to stop and refuel 2 or 3 times along the way, that gave the Beatles and Tony and Jimmie Nicol a real opportunity to get together, and I felt that that was when I see footage after that, it looks like Jimmy is very comfortable. The Beatles, it looks like they've bonded, and I see them joking with each other and that sort of thing, and they just seem locked in with Jimmy, both on stage and at press conferences after the Tony Sheridan experience.
Mm.
So we just have to keep that in mind that sure that first time did look a little awkward to all of us, but I think that just settled down once they were like, oh well, Tony had him in his band, he's gotta be good, you know.
Yeah,
So that
yeah.
was kind of an interesting, another one of those things. I can't even remember now how I learned that Tony Sheridan was on the plane, but as soon as I did, I was digging all over to find, contact for Tony, because to be able to learn what went on the plane and to learn that it was actually a good bonding moment was really cool.
That Australian tour was a cultural watershed for this country, and it's still often talked about within the popular culture and referred to. Of course, Adelaide petitions to get them across, and we see upward of 300,000 people come out to greet them. They're the biggest mass gathering to welcome them in their career, if I have that stat right. I don't think it was ever bettered.
It was the greatest welcome the Beatles ever got at any time, anywhere in the world.
It's remarkable, isn't it?
And it was Australia. That's where the fans poured out, right there.
And then Jimmy plays 2 nights there in Adelaide over June 12 and June 13.
Yeah.
And this is an incredible crescendo to this period in his story with them that is completely flipped on its head. Just a couple of days later, there's that image of him on June 15. I remember seeing as a young guy when I was still discovering this part of the story, seeing this image of him at Melbourne Airport sitting alone with his right leg, I think, is up, and he's got a bag and he's kind of waiting, and it looks like there's nobody there.
Yeah. I actually went there, and that hangar waiting area is still there, and it looks the same. And how many decades have gone by? It's no longer an airport for passengers. They turn it into an airport for commercial flying, cargo or whatnot. But that interior is the same as it was then. It's incredible. No one remodeled.
Yeah.
Anyway, what was your question?
Well, I guess if a picture says 1,000 things, that is one that absolutely does. And
yes.
There was obviously this incredible psychological pressure on these guys for that period. I think George makes that comment in Anthology, which I've talked about before, about, they gave their money and their screams, but we gave our nervous systems, which is sometimes the hardest thing to give. And the fact that they all came through it largely okay, when as I mentioned before, when not everybody did through that decade under that immense pressure. And
right.
I often look at that image and wonder what's happening there for that man in that moment at the crossroads of whatever is to come next.
That's really interesting. As we said, that was the biggest, greatest gathering of fans ever to greet the Beatles. And Jimmy was, riding in the car up on top and convertible, and and streamers are coming down. You would have thought it was Queen Elizabeth or whoever. She was queen then, I think. Visiting someone, royalty or someone, and you see it in the newsreels. And I talked to one female fan in Melbourne, and I was chatting with her. She was actually the gal that was running the archive, and bringing out the different records for me. And I said, you look to be about the age that you would have been a young teenage girl there. And she goes, oh yeah, I was in the crowd. I stood outside the hotel in Melbourne when, all 5 Beatles were up there waving. Ringo had come back, and they were all waving. And she said, I got in a lot of trouble that day. But I said, why'd you get in trouble? And she said, well, I had blonde hair. And if you look at that old footage of all these kids, all the girls had dark black hair or brown hair. I'm the only one with blonde hair out of 300,000 people. And she said, I had called in pretending to be my mom to the Catholic school and told the nuns that my daughter was sick, which was me. And she said, the big camera that was up with the Beatles, kind of filming them from the side as they waved, it panned downward. And when it spotted me, I'm the only blonde, and they zoomed in on me. And she said, oh man, the next day they had seen me, all the nuns, and they called an assembly of the whole school, and they put me up on stage, and they said that, I was going to the devil and all this horrible stuff. I said, can I put that in the book? And she said, well, you can't use my name. And I said, why not? She said, well, because I don't want to get in trouble with that school anymore. I said, I'm pretty sure they're all dead, all those nuns.
That's right. That's gold.
And she goes, I'm not taking any chances. So I changed her name. But the point is, there's this huge crowd all loving the Beatles. But for Jimmie, we know that it wasn't a forever thing. He hadn't been made a permanent member. Ringo had come back. So things had to end. I'm sure Jimmie was aware of it, but at the same time, he was having such a good time. They were playing well together, and they were joking around. They had bonded, and so I'm sure it was kind of a tough ending. And as George Harrison taught us, all things must pass.
Yeah.
So I think he was really in shock at the end of the tour, and it sort of shows in that famous picture you're talking about, which is in my book.
Yeah.
It almost looks like what I would call PTSD, like someone who's just been through a war or something. He's just been through this crazy, amazing experience for 2 weeks where everybody wants you and loves you, and you're part of this really important big thing. So then it's over so quickly. Those 2 weeks must have gone by very quickly. But he really, I think the important thing is he performed beautifully for the Beatles and the crowds. He was very professional in his speaking to the media. He was professional on stage and off. And I think his maturity showed through. I think he realized, because he was interviewed with Brian Epstein right at the end before he got on the plane. And he talked about how he had some opportunities. Pi Records had put together a group for him, and he was going to come back and he was going to record a song and all this. So, I think he thought, well, maybe this can be a springboard for me. And so, I think it was very difficult to go from those polar opposites, top of the world, to now we're sending you home in an airplane. But I think he still did well for what he was supposed to do. Tony Barrow? No, Tony Bramwell, who was Brian's assistant, told me we were very, very proud of what Jimmie did for us, and we could not have gotten through that emergency experience without him, and he performed admirably.
I was watching Man on the Run just recently, the new McCartney doc, and there's a little quote from Henry McCulloch talking about the final moments of Wings for him when Paul, Linda and Denny head over for Band on the Run. And he has this line, and again, different set of circumstances completely, but he had this line, it was like a dream. This period for him, playing with Paul, doing this thing, on reflection, it was just like a dream that had to end. Like, similarly, different set of circumstances that lead to it, but similarly for Jimmie, I wonder if also that sat with him too, almost as time moved by. It's almost like I dreamt it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's a good way of explaining it.
Mm. There's a lot to be said for Jimmie's character, I found going through the book. We get so many tell-alls from people in near orbit and direct orbit over the years to varying
Yeah.
degrees of success. He doesn't do that. And the man was a Beatle. And
Hmm.
in fact, he kind of does the opposite and stays away from talking about that deeply and openly. And that, to me, says something about the man's character. I wonder when you went through this process for The Beatle Who Vanished, by the time you got to the end of it, what's your own unique sense of the man?
I would say I think Jimmie was a very unique, determined individualist. He knew his worth as a drummer. Everyone I interviewed, musicians, his wife later in Mexico, Julia Villaseñor, everyone I interviewed really liked him, both before, during, and after the Beatles. No one ever said, "Oh, I hated that guy." That just never came up. And he loved to learn new things. He never wanted to stand still or just you know, lay back and go, well, I've done it all. You know, it was always moving forward. He loved challenges. And when he would vanish and turn up in another country, which made it take me 7 years to figure out what happened to the Beatle Who Vanished, he loved the challenge of making a new life for himself once he got to a new place. So I found that very impressive. One other point, you mentioned that he never really talked about, that experience. Well, I got very lucky. He did go to one Beatle convention, and that was in 1984 in Amsterdam. And the organizer of the convention did share with me an audio tape that had never been heard before, where they basically went into a back room and said, "Hey, can we interview you?" But they never did anything with the interview. And so it wasn't like he wanted to talk about it, but he went along with it. And in the book, I basically talk about what he said. But one of the things he wanted to do, he said, was to write a book about his experience, not just with the Beatles, but his whole career. And he never did do that. So you're welcome, Jimmie. I did it.
And done it exceptionally well. It is, I mentioned earlier, it's a great gift into Beatledom. What continues to keep you inspired with all this work that you're doing? And I know you sent a photograph when we first connected. You sent me a photograph that kind of evoked something that might be coming up. And I don't want to give away too much in case I shouldn't, but it gave me a
I'll tell
sense
you
of
about
what might be there. But over to you.
it. Yeah, I'll be happy to. Well, first of all, I just love finding new rock and roll stories that have not really been fully explored or solved if it's a mystery. Um, and so currently I'm working on two books. One's coming out this year. It's not a mystery, but it's something that goes further into the relationship between Elvis Presley and his original guitarist, Scotty Moore, who was also his first manager. And so I had spent about 4 years interviewing Scotty Moore on the telephone, at the start of the 2000s. Maybe it was around 2010, I'm not sure. And I just never got around to doing anything with it. But I'm gonna put out a book this year called Elvis Presley: Conversations with Scotty Moore.
Ah,
And the book is all 100% in Scotty's words from years of us talking, and he tells what it was like first discovering Elvis, convincing Sam Phillips to let him bring him over to his house and audition him and check out his voice, and becoming his first guitarist, his first manager, his confidant. We hear from Scotty Moore firsthand about their early recordings, all the way through the rock tours, having Bill Black's bass fly off the top of the car and smash, and cars breaking down and all that. the TV shows they went on, Elvis having to sing to a hound, "You ain't nothing but a hound dog."
Yeah.
We hear about the first Hollywood movies he has to make, and uh, all the way up to the last time they really were together was what we had a TV show here in America called the 1968 Singer Sewing Machine comeback show or something like that. It
Yeah.
was sponsored by Singer Sewing Machines, and it was a big special. He did, his song and dance and all that. And there's a great little part where he jams with Scotty and DJ Fontana on the stage, kind of like a Elvis Presley unplugged session.
Yeah.
And then he revealed to me these secrets about Colonel Parker, and how he felt Parker sort of mistreated Elvis's career. He explained to me why Elvis never got to tour Australia, where he had a big fan base, or Europe, where he had a really big fan base. And so I think it's just a fun book to hear in his own words what it was like. And sadly, Scotty Moore's no longer with us, so I thought it would be important to put this book out about his career. The one where I sent you a picture of me and John Lennon in the same doorway in Hamburg. Next year, I'm releasing a book called John Lennon's Mendip's Mystery Guitar.
Huh.
Mendip's, of course, is the name of his childhood home where he lived with Aunt Mimi. In 1996, not that long ago, well, I guess it was that long ago, a solid electric 1950s Dallas tuxedo guitar was found hidden up in John Lennon's childhood loft. And Yoko Ono and Sean Lennon gave me special permission to go investigate the home and go up into the loft and work on this mystery, which was very nice of them. And so the book is about, did John steal one of the first guitars ever made in England, an electric guitar? Was it his? Did he use it? Was he ever seen or photographed with it? Would he have written any songs, with Paul McCartney with it when they were young? So my book delves into all of this, and it kind of starts with the discovery. Actually, it starts with John stealing a guitar in Manchester at they did some kind of a thing as Johnny and the Moondogs. It was a contest. And so it starts with him stealing a guitar, and then we kind of go fast forward to the guitar being discovered in 96. And I keep going back and forth between the past, the 50s and 60s, and the present, and what happened with this guitar in the present. And it's a fun mystery, and of course, I will solve the mystery.
Yeah, I love it. There's no
nothing I hate more than unsolved mysteries.
Yeah, look, there's no one out there doing quite what you're doing with popular music authorship. So wishing you continued successes. Where should people go if they'd like to find you, your work, and discover more?
Sure. Well, my books in Australia are all at amazon.com.au, or at least I hope they are.
They are.
And good. And they can learn more about my general rock and roll detective career at my website, which is 3W's.rockandrolldetective.com, rockandrolldetective.com. I'm on social media, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, X, TikTok, Threads. Also, if you're interested in my TV and film credits, we have a site over here called imdb.com where you can go and you can search under Jim Berkenstadt and see what I've done in the TV movie world. I just finished another really cool music documentary called If These Walls Could Rock, and I believe it'll be available at Amazon and on Apple and other places in May or June, the documentary. It tells the story of some 30 or 40 rock stars that have secretly stayed at this hotel bungalow called the Sunset Marquis Hotel. And it also has a recording studio in the basement, and tells the story of how these rock stars sort of were communally became friends. They didn't ordinarily know each other, but it's one of those extended stay type bungalow hotels where people can stay for a long period of time. Uh, the actor Billy Bob Thornton said, "Yeah, I come here after each divorce. I come here and spend a couple, 2, 3 years here. Even though I have a mansion over there, it's lonely. So here I get to commune, and hang out and play guitar with people. So it's a really cool place. And what's interesting, the studio wasn't originally built there. There was just a basement. And one night, Jeff Beck, the guitarist, who many know was with the Yardbirds and had a solo career and all that. He had a huge amp in his room and his guitar, and he was just wailing on his guitar at 2 a.m. And the general manager got a lot of complaints and said, "Yeah, can I just take you in the basement? It's really too loud." So they moved this huge amp down there, and Jeff plugged in and played, and nobody was disturbed. And then this gave the general manager an idea, and a few years later they built a full recording studio in the basement of this hotel, which I recently went there and got to see it. It's amazing. Yeah. So some of the stars that are interviewed are Bruce Springsteen, Ringo Starr, Dave Grohl of Nirvana and Foo Fighters, Sheryl Crow, Slash, I think that's Guns N' Roses.
Yes.
Was he Guns N'
Roses? Yeah, that's it.
Cyndi Lauper, Julian Lennon, Morrissey, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Billy Gibbons of ZZ Top, Rod Stewart, U2, Depeche Mode, Little Steven, Miley Cyrus, and Billy Bob Thornton. But there are more. That's all I could think of when I jotted them down. But it's really amazing to hear all the stories these people have. The other interesting thing about this movie is it's not just about sex, drugs, rock and roll, and collaboration and friendship, but it's also, there's a second story about the dad who first built the hotel, and he built it because he became friends with Hugh Hefner, and Hefner had built like the Playboy club or mansion down the street. And so this guy ended up getting to put all the girls that were being photographed and all the bunnies, they would all stay at his hotel. And as a bachelor, he found that a lot of fun. So anyway, he built this place, he kept expanding it, and then eventually, and his son was named Marquis. So Sunset Marquis was really named after his son. And ultimately, it's a story of how the son later came in, and there's always friction between father and son in a business. But eventually, the son convinced the dad, and he's turned it into an even better place now. So there's that side story. So it's kind of a fun movie.
Yeah, I am sold. That sounds incredible. I've never heard that story before. It sounds amazing.
I hadn't either until the director called me up and said, find me some rare stuff on these people.
Yeah.
Said, yes, sir.
I bet you did. Jim.
He's the same guy that told me I had to find that wedding video.
Of Sebastian Bach back in the day.
Yeah, Sebastian Bach.
Yeah. We were talking just before we started here about, I've been very fortunate with this podcast talking to people like Kid O'Toole and Jude Kessler, Alan Kozin. And the thing, as we were talking, that I've found again and again, Beatle people are very good people. And this conversation has brought that home to me again. I want to thank you for being so generous with all the time you've given me. I want to congratulate you on this wonderful body of work that is in the world for not only fans of popular music, but Beatle fans who appreciate deep, detailed, authoritative work. There's some wonderful things there that you're doing, and obviously some terrific things that are coming down the road. Thank you so much for joining me here on the podcast. It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's been a real honor to be on your show, and I really had a lot of fun. And some amazingly great questions. So things that I didn't even expect. So thank you.
Much appreciate that. Thank you. See you next time.
See you next time. Take care.
We hope you enjoyed the show. You know the name, look up the socials. You'll find us on Facebook and Instagram where we can all come together. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe and spread the word. It all helps raise the profile of the You Can Talk to Me podcast. Thanks for listening.